Thank you very much, and good morning. This talk is called Freethought, Historical Context and Hysterical Connections. So let's begin. First of all, why should we bother with this? We're forever thinking about this topic in the planning committee or the leadership group because it's our job to lead and not to follow. So here we have an example. 30% of Americans wanted to let Jewish children come to America after the Holocaust. So if we were to go out and do a Pew Research survey, we probably would not have let any Jewish children come here, and none of those people on the floor would have been part of our society. Sometimes, for reasons that completely elude me, people confuse leading with following. So they think what leading means is to take a poll of everyone around, see what they want, and take them there. At best, that makes you an Uber driver. You figure out where people want to go and you take them there. That's the opposite of leadership. Leadership tries to figure out what you believe in your heart is right, or maybe from some God you worship, and lead people there. So why should we look at the past when we're trying to decide on our direction? When leadership is trying to set a direction for the group, why are we looking in the rearview mirror? And it seems in a way foolish. We ought to be really progressive and just jump out to the forefront and by God we'll do whatever we want. This is America, we take a vote, bada bing, bada boom. So why do we look to the past? Because we don't want to repeat our previous mistakes, of course. We want to gain context so that our decisions can be wise instead of random and irresponsible. Most of us have had the experience of removing something or changing something only to find out the hard way why it was done like that. So before we change something, we need to understand why it's there and what's going to fall down when we remove it. Maybe it's a load-bearing wall. So that's one reason to understand the past. Here we have a fellow who you might say ignored all the rules and became rich. This is Picasso, of course. That's not him on the right. I mean, this is his art, you know. And Pablo Picasso was one of the very few artists who was rich and famous in his lifetime. So just like Charles Dickens, he was traveling around the world, living a kind of Mick Jagger lifestyle of being a big celebrity. And his huge success came from breaking all the rules, putting all the body parts in the wrong place, using colors that aren't natural, and so on. So you might say that this is an argument for not looking at the past, or at least not being shackled by the tradition and the ways of the past. This odd-looking contraption was sold by Christie's in May 2015 for just over $179 million US. Of course, Pablo didn't get a dime of that. The thing about Picasso is, as crazy as many of his drawings were, the most famous ones, he actually could do regular drawing. Here is a perfectly ordinary and well-executed drawing of a person. It shows that he can follow the rules. And when he breaks the rules, it's not because he doesn't know them or because he's some kind of vandal. He has a reason for breaking the rules, and he's doing it to make a point within a context. Breaking the rules for no reason strikes me like vandalism. Some teachers think the way to be creative is to remove constraints. For example, here is a man tied in a rope. Can he play the violin? What if we cut away all the rope? Can he play the violin? Not unless he has lessons or something. They completely missed the point. Creativity comes from constraints. If you're a single mom with one small income, you get very creative about dinner. So if we build a creative, free-thinking community, it's because we respected our constraints, not ignored them and threw them away. Here's a very ordinary drawing from Pablo Picasso, and this sold in 2004 for $104 million US. So even his boring work or more ordinary work is worth quite a bit. So the reason we look to the past is so we can make wise and in some sense classy decisions about where we're going to go in the future. So that's the premise of this talk, why we should have a look back. In some sense, free thinking begins with Martin Luther, as the story goes, nailing his 95 theses on the door. He didn't do that, of course, but there is a door which has carved in it his objections to the Catholic Church, including indulgences. So in a certain sense, in 1517, Martin Luther was a freethinker by rejecting a lot of the rules of the Catholic Church. But we wouldn't think of him as a kindred spirit. This is Neil deGrasse Tyson's view of the beginning of free thought. And this is Giordano Bruno, and most scientists would name him as the first free thinker. Bruno was a Dominican monk, and he was caught reading Erasmus, the Dutch humanist. And you're not allowed to read that, so he ran away so he wouldn't get punished. And in effect, he blogged while he was in exile. Eventually, he was captured by Cardinal Bellarmine of the Inquisition, and they charged him with the following: holding opinions contrary to the Catholic faith about the Trinity, the divinity of Christ, the Incarnation, the virginity of Mary, the transubstantiation, Mass, the singularity of this world, also advocating belief in reincarnation as beasts, also speaking against the church and its ministers, and just for good measure, dealing in magics and divination. But except for all that, they really liked him. So he was brought up on trial, and it was decided that he was guilty and he should recant all these things on December 21st of 1599. He refused to recant. On January 20th, Pope Clement VIII declared him a heretic, and the Inquisition, not the Pope, sentenced him to death, and the sentence was carried out on February 17th of the year 1600. So for Neil deGrasse Tyson and for many scientists, this is the beginning of free thought. For hundreds of years, people had been arguing with the church, denying that there was a God, but they were doing it mostly from the outside. So there are two reasons maybe that the scientists have picked Bruno. For one reason, he was very much from the inside. He was a Dominican monk. Secondly, he based his defense on his right as a Protestant to think for himself. One of the biographers said Bruno was claiming for the philosopher a principle of free thought and inquiry which implied an entirely new concept of authority, that of the individual intellect in its serious and continuing pursuit of autonomous inquiry. He made it his defense that humans are allowed to, in fact, are required to think for themselves. So maybe that's why the scientists land on him. Oh, by the way, there's a little arrow at the top so we can keep track of the time in case you're interested in doing that. 1611, the King James Bible comes out. Why is a king writing a Bible? Of course, he isn't writing a Bible. He's overseeing translations. This is the third English Bible to appear in England, so there are Protestants who are reading the Bible for themselves in their own language already, and they are objectors to the Catholic Church. In 1634, we have the arrival of this woman. Her name is Anne Hutchinson. She arrived to Puritan, Massachusetts on September 18th of 1634. And what she liked to do is to gather after the church service with other women in her kitchen and talk about the sermon. And people put up with this briefly. But after a while, more people started to come to her meetings, so people started to get alarmed. The Massachusetts General Court cast her out of Massachusetts for sedition and heresy. This was April of 1936, 2 years after she came. They threw her out. They said she was to be delivered to Satan as a heathen and a leper. So I get heathen, but isn't leper a medical condition? So she was kicked out of town. She went briefly to set up a godless society in Rhode Island, and that was supported by the mayor of Providence. But eventually she had to move even further away, and she ended up not quite at, but near this Split Rock, where they set up a farm in what is now the Bronx. So they'd moved pretty far away. And at that time, well, you know, you can tell how this is going to end. The local natives came and killed the family, her and several children. Her husband was already dead. So that ended badly. Most people would say the word free thinker comes into our language as a thing, as a concept in 1697. And I mean, if you read 22 books on this topic, at least 18 of them will agree on that starting point, that exact starting point. So we have a letter from Molyneux. Molyneux is an Irish philosopher and also politician. On April 6th of 1697, he spoke about John Toland, another Irish philosopher, and he described him as a candid free thinker, 3 separate words. And to our knowledge, that's the first use of the term free thinker to describe someone who's sort of an agnostic. 1713, Collins comes out with this book, which is called A Discourse of Free Thinking Occasioned by the Rise and Growth of a Sect called Freethinkers. He was a philosopher, and like Einstein, he was a deist or a deist. He believed that there was some kind of creator, and if you wanted to know anything about that creator, you should study science, study physics, study trees, study ants, and then you'll see what that creator did, and you'll learn more about him or her or it or them or what have you. But the notion of a personal God to whom you could pray for a Mercedes-Benz is silly. His writings gather together the results of previous English freethinkers who now have a name by which to be lumped together. In France, we have the same thing coming fairly soon. This is 1765, and in their encyclopedia, the French group included freethinking as a term, and people like Voltaire and so on were following freethought by then. Then we skip ahead to Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine, of course, was one of the founding fathers, a very smart fellow, very revolutionary. Everybody loved him. When he went over to France to work with the revolutionaries over there, he started to write his thoughts about religion, and people didn't appreciate that so much. He didn't notice that because he was in France, and people were fine with this in France. Yes, no God, okay, fine. When Jefferson got in and he had a chance to come back in 1802, he was not welcomed back. He had, I believe, 6 people attended his funeral. He wrote this. He's absolutely a believer in God, by the way, in spite of how people reacted to him. And here are 2 paragraphs from his book. Every national religion has established itself by pretending to some special mission from God, communicated by a special person. Moses for the Jews, Jesus for the Christians, Muhammad for the Turks. As if the way to God were not open to every man alike. Each of these churches show certain books which they call Revelation or the Word of God, Torah for the Jews, Bible for the Christians, Quran for the Turks. Each accuses the other of unbelief, and for my part, I disbelieve them all. So people lock onto that phrase and take that to mean he doesn't believe in any religion. All religions are bunk, and I'm an atheist, and so on. Robert Owen comes from Wales. He goes to Scotland. He falls in love with the owner's daughter of a mill, so he buys the mill, marries her, and makes a lot of money. He already made a lot of money in Manchester. He's a very successful business person. While in Scotland, he started to develop socialist ideals, and he thought that every worker should be paid the same, and every person should get a chunk of land and that kind of thing. So this has nothing to do with free thought. He doesn't particularly have a problem with the Bible or with religion, but he is a socialist. So he has a lot of money, and his son is looking for a way to make his fortune. This is Robert Dale Owen, so he comes to America. And he decides, using his dad's money, of course, to set up some cities. And of course, the most famous one is New Harmony. And he sets up experimental cities, which are socialist utopias, like the kibbutz in Israel. And like the kibbutz in Israel, it lasted for a while, and then it didn't work. So this is Robert Dale Owen. He was born in Glasgow. He came here and happened to meet over here a partner. And here she is. This is Fanny Wright, who's very famous in the history of free thought and also in feminism. And right here, we have the place where kind of socialism, humanist values being expressed in society, is overlapping or mixing or blending in with free thought. Let's see, Scottish-born social reformer. She wrote 2 plays. She came to America. Each of them was a hit. People were shocked in America that she actually put her female name on as the author of the plays. Nobody had ever dared to do such a thing. And she started giving speeches on her own about education, marriage, birth control, and other things that made her a lecturer and a target of vilification, as you can well imagine, because we're talking about 1828. She earned the nickname Red Harlot of Infidelity. And worse, a female version of Thomas Paine. She also was confidant to General Lafayette. General Lafayette was a big hero of our revolution, although he was in France, and she used to go to his house and sleep in his room. So that's what confidant means. And the Owenites were the only foreign influencers within free thought at this time, with one exception that we'll talk about. So generally speaking, everybody who was pushing free thought in America was American. So they weren't being accused of being like foreigners who were bringing outside ideas, not yet. The exception was Ernestine Rose, who we'll see in a minute, who was the Polish daughter of an Orthodox rabbi. She became an atheist at 17 after she was reading through things in the Torah that she didn't agree with. She was known for not dressing fancy and always having these ringlets, intentionally doing things that she thought would get some attention. And she was very effective at doing that. Now later on, many more Jews started to come from German and from other areas, and these are some of the communities that the German Jews had been involved in, which are free thought communities. And they formed many societies, and in Germany these were 2 of the main ones. And those German Jews who came over brought that free thinking with them to America, more so even than English or French people did. One thing that they did, Felix Adler came here and he formed the New York Society for Ethical Culture in 1876. In 1902 they bought that building, which is brick, although it wasn't at the time, And then in 9 years later, they bought the one next to it. And the one next to it is the hall where they meet. Later on, the Jews who came to America were coming from Russia and from East Europe. And those folks are more demonstrative in their religion. They didn't mix as well, and anti-Semitism started to build up in America. So the Jews who were here earlier got an awful lot of stuff done in terms of secularizing religion in general in America. Most historians will say after the Civil War and before the First World War, so maybe 1870 to 1914, is the golden age of free thought. People start to really get a hold of this idea and think, yeah, this is good. These guys might be right. So one of them was the Boston Investigator. You can see their office there. It was the first American newspaper dedicated to the philosophy of free thought. It was started in 1831 by Abner Neeland, who's kind of interesting himself, and published by John Q. Adams. Another huge paper at this time was the Freethought Ideal. It was run by Etta Semple, another famous woman in the women's movement on her own merits. She was an American atheist and feminist, editor, publisher. She was in Ottawa, Kansas, of all places, where you can go now to see a Creation Museum and, I don't know, maybe Noah's Ark and such. And she had quite a following, and in the end she set up a natural cure sanatorium. So I think she got into theosophy later on. She got a little bit spiritual, but still remained not religious. And she was furthering the cause of free thought across America. So was this character, but we try not to mention him. This guy here is from Waco, Texas. He owned and edited the Iconoclast newspaper. He was particularly noted for his writings attacking religious conservatism. He said, "I have nothing against Baptists. I just believe they were not held under long enough." What he really hated most of all was Baylor University in Waco, Texas, which was run by the Baptists. And his claim was that the male teachers were sleeping with the female students, and anybody who sends their daughter there is a fool. So one of the fathers who sent his daughter to the university shot him dead. The biggest of the papers by far was a truth seeker, and on the masthead you see science, morals, free thought, free inquiry, and the diffusion of liberal sentiments. So it says, we extend a right of fellowship to liberal minds of all grades and classes. We ask them not to adopt our special views and opinions, to see with our eyes, or to understand with our reason. The alliance of freethinkers with the political left is not because of any shared economic or social views. Freethinkers consider both socialism and communism to be religions like any other. That's worth thinking about for just a second, because if you're a freethinker, one thing you're not is a conformist. You don't want to be an ist of any kind. But there are many things that we share in common, not least of which is the urgent desire to keep the church out of government. And that's shared by Baptists, Mormons, any kind of minority church. They don't want the church to be running the government either. The Catholics also at this time. And any groups like socialists, communists, whatever. This is Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She went to a meeting with her husband, Quakers Abolition Meeting to End Slavery, and they told her, "You have to wait outside. We don't have women in here." She was completely shocked. She thought people who favored abolition and didn't think people should be slaves and be owned as possessions surely didn't want to treat women like that. So she was shocked, and she started movements to resist that. Resolved that the great principle of the Protestant Reformation, the right of the individual conscience and judgment, heretofore exercised by man alone, should now be claimed by women, that in the interpretation of Scripture she should be guided by her own reason, not the authority of the church. Once again, this is not an atheist. She believes in God. She just believes that she should be allowed to interpret and understand what God is saying on her own. Her own voice ought to count for something, as it does for men. So these are not atheists, and in fact, many of them wrote about atheism. Atheism is caused by ignorance. Free thinking is the cure. This is Susan B. Anthony, and she is the one who's famous, not Elizabeth Stanton. And they were working together side by side all this time, but Elizabeth Stanton wanted to rail against the church and against paternalism. And Susan B. Anthony, who was more politically adroit, said, that's not going to fly. And of course she was right. We have stamps for Susan B. Anthony. We have nothing for Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So in terms of politics, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was not able to be pragmatic and put aside her passion to attack the church in order to get the message out there. which is good. She stuck to her principles. And Susan B. Anthony bent her principles, or, limited them just a little bit, disciplined them, let's say, to get the job done. Now we have Robert Ingersoll. Now, maybe it's just me, but that looks to me like Marlon Brando. He had a great political career starting. He became an attorney general, and he gave speeches the likes of which people hadn't heard. People came from miles around to hear him speak. He was passionate. He was articulate. He goes down in history as the great agnostic. He wrote to Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and he said, "I have done but little for what you call the cause of woman. I thought it of more importance to get superstition out of her head than put a ballot in her hand." That sounds a little bit sarcastic, but it's not. He's being colorful. But what he explained in the rest of that letter is, if I had become part of your movement, people would have been busy attacking my atheism or my agnosticism, and you wouldn't have gotten anywhere with your message, so I left you alone. He built a reputation for oratory. He became Attorney General of Illinois, but nothing else. He was a Republican. In that day, the Republicans were the progressive group, but they were still conservative financially. For example, he supported the gold standard, something that freethinkers would be unlikely to support. Now, what happens at around 1900 is people start to look back at the movement. When did it begin? Write histories about it. Probably the best book on this subject is Robertson's. He said the following: "It would, on some counts, have been not inappropriate, for instance, to name as a practical freethinker Leonardo da Vinci, who struck out a new paths in so many lines of science." So he's thinking, in a sense, freethinkers are anybody who thought in a brand new way. But, on the other hand, one might be accused of straining the evidence in claiming as a freethinker a man not known to have avowed any objection to the teaching of the church. So for him, unless you're resisting the church, you're not a free thinker. That's what the word's for. The word is reserved for those people who are objecting to the church, who are resisting the dogma and authority of the church. 1925 comes along. You probably know these characters. On the left is Clarence Darrow. He's on our side. On the right is William Jennings Bryan, and he's on the side of the Butler Act, which says, "Don't you dare mention evolution in school." Scopes was a part-time teacher, and he's not even sure he ever mentioned evolution, but he joined in with the suit anyway so we could get this going, get this tested, and of course he was found guilty and so on. Many of us thought, not that we were personally there, but many freethinkers thought, okay, this is the last dying gasp of fundamentalism. But in fact, it was the exact opposite. It was the birth of the religious right, who doubled down, which set about welding the words godless and communism together. Now we have Bertrand Russell, an odd-looking character, nice pipe though. Expression free thought is often used as if it meant merely opposition to the prevailing orthodoxy. But this is only a symptom of free thought. The person who is free in any respect is free from something. What is the freethinker free from? To be worthy of the name, he must be free of two things. One, the force of tradition, and two, the tyranny of his own passions. So in other words, you're not a freethinker if you're conservative in the sense of following your forefathers' ideas for the sake of tradition. You're also not a freethinker if you believe what makes you feel nice in your tummy. So emotions is not a good enough evidence for him. What makes a freethinker is not his beliefs, but the way in which he holds them. If he holds them because his elders told him they were true when he was young, or if he holds them because if he did not, he would be unhappy, his thought is not free. But if he holds them because after careful thought he finds a balance of the evidence in his favor, then he is a free thinker no matter how odd his conclusion. So you could be a Baptist and be a free thinker. You just show me how your logic led you to this. How did your sense of reasoning lead you to, I should be a Baptist and believe that stuff. And many Baptists can make such claims, which they deeply believe. Here's Annie Laurie Gaylor. We all saw her very recently here in the other room next door. Free thought means the use of reason in forming opinions about religion rather than basing belief on faith, authority, or tradition. Now, when we started this group, we rephrased that a little bit. And we said free thought means the use of reason in forming opinions about important things, including religion, rather than basing belief on faith, authority, or tradition. So we wanted to make an opening for things other than religion. But the thing about religion is it asks you to believe on the basis of hearsay testimony from a pastor or from a scripture. And science doesn't ask us to believe that way. Science asks us to believe in the scientific method. So religion is one of the very few areas, if not the only area, where we're asked to take things on faith. So religion is the main thing that we object to. This is called the Freethought Project. And you can see what the articles are about. The airport shooter said he was mind controlled by, I don't know, CIA or somebody, and so on. So this is a conspiracy theory site. The Freethought LLC, they own this name. They have a corporation. They're in Louisiana. And this is their website. And you can see their graphic, which is open the mind and let it flop anywhere, which is a way of defining free thinking, but not a way that I would support, for what that's worth. Here's what they claim in describing their group. The mission of the Freethought Project is to foster the creation and expansion of liberty-minded solutions to modern-day tyrannical oppression. The Freethought Project is dedicated to holding those who claim authority over our lives accountable. Those of us at the Freethought Project have dedicated our lives to shining light into the darkness of these corrupt and so on and so forth, so you get the mood. There are three more parts. First of all, what are the themes that we've seen in this history? There is such a thing as free thought, a concept, an idea of thinking for yourself instead of taking the pastor's words at face value. Baptists have almost nothing in common with us, but they do want to separate church and state. On the other hand, we have anarchists, and they don't want to listen to the authority of the church. They reject that, but they also reject the authority of everybody. Activists, social activists, and they have a lot in common with us because they have humanistic values and they believe we can pull together, help the community. We don't need a God to drive us to do that. Environmentalists, the same thing, I would say. Feminists, much more overlap because they have a particular gripe against the church, as we do. So what I want to say about this is there are people here who feel when they come to these meetings like they've been parachuted into a Che Guevara birthday party. They look at the last 12 months of speakers, and one guy left a Jehovah's Witness church, but the other speakers are like, let's save the planet, let's save the whales, global warming, there's too much population. Are you guys ever going to talk about religion? If you're feeling like that, like you're being surrounded by these lefties, you're absolutely right. I'm here to validate that feeling, that your general free thinker is usually sort of to the left. On the other hand, if you think, well, this is a terrible problem and we got to get to work to fix this, no, you're way out of order, because the socialists and the free thinkers have a huge overlap in their goals. And then when it comes to atheists, there weren't very many atheists in the early free thought movement. There are a lot now, really a lot of atheists in the movement. Those are the themes. Here's my opinions. When it comes to free thought, I feel like it should be protected. We shouldn't allow the Lake Superior Freethinkers to become the Lake Superior feminists. But we should care about feminism and we should fight for it, and I'll show you how I propose we should do that. We should keep away from Baptists because we don't really have anything in common with them, and that's such a pragmatic thing, throwing all our values out the window to get work done. I wouldn't do it. Anarchists, I think we should avoid them because, frankly, they sound nuts. And maybe they're right. I'm not for a minute suggesting they're not right, but they still sound nuts. And so unless you want to sound nuts to the general community, I recommend we keep away from Alex Jones and so forth. Activists, I think we should have a spoke. I think we should have a splinter group from our group that goes out and helps Lutheran social services, hand out coats to the homeless and so on. Environmentalists, I think we have a lot of people who are really devoted to this, who want to live in tiny houses and not leave a big footprint in that, and I think that's extremely important. Feminists are most assuredly a spoke of our group. We have more and more women in the group. We want to be welcoming. Socialists, a lot of socialists, we should by all means get together on Saturday and organize and print signs and, raise hell, march on City Hall, by all means. But free thinking is not socialist. And last, atheist, I think arguably that's become part of what free thought is about now. As a judgment call that free thinking and atheism are pretty seriously overlapped at this point in our history. The hub is to promote secular worldview. And we love Bernie and we want feminism and so on and so forth. And we love all that stuff, don't get me wrong, but that's not the hub. If you don't love Jesus, I hope you feel welcome here because you're trying to live a secular life. You don't have a God to blame for your problems. You can't just fall down on your knees and pray to God when your mother dies and it doesn't make any sense and it's not fair. You don't have that. You're living without that crutch. And I don't care if you're right wing, left wing, top wing, whatever. You should feel welcome here. You shouldn't feel like there's a million commies trying to, sign you up to their union. So that's my plea, that we keep our main focus on helping people survive life without an imaginary friend. I'd love to think Jesus is up here looking out for me. But so far, we haven't been getting along. Now, this is the final thing, and I want to explain graphically why I'm so sold on this thing, that we should keep our focus on what we're supposed to be doing, keep our focus on the main event, because when we try to keep our focus on the main event, the discussion goes sideways. This boat is going to Florida. Somebody on the boat says, hey, let's go to Virginia Beach. No, we're going to Florida. Yeah, but Virginia Beach is just like Florida. Like socialism's just like free thinking. Sort of connected, isn't it? Yeah, maybe, but we're going to Florida. Why are you limiting my free expression? Why are you censoring me? It's not about that at all. Keeping your eyes on the prize and refusing to be distracted by shiny things, that's not censorship. That's called focus. And that's the only way there is to get stuff done. And that's it for me. Thank you very much.